And I think the beauty of our kids is they do have some traits that come from us, so they become wonderful mirrors, sometimes potentially very frustrating mirrors, but wonderful mirrors. Early on in my own trauma journey, I actually had a therapist say, never waste a trigger. And I learned to become very grateful, actually, for the ways that my kids knew me so well that they had these experiences that would be great for triggering me. And I felt like that showed me so much about myself.
Hello and welcome back to another episode of the Thrive State Podcast. I am your host, Dr. V, triple board certified MD and performance and longevity expert. And on today's podcast, we teach you how to parent. Now, whether or not you have kids in your life, you might have a nephew, you might have a niece, you might have children that are in your life. In fact, you were once a child, and if you go through and listen through the lens of parenting, you may start to understand there are potentially some aspects of your childhood that never really got resolved from how your parents actually treated you growing up. Now, so much of health, happiness, human potential, how we show up in the world, how we perform in the world, all stems from our consciousness. Are we living from a consciousness of fear, of scarcity, of limiting beliefs? Or are we really living in a consciousness where anything is possible, where we could step into the best versions of ourselves? Now, we might not be aware of this, but so much of our consciousness is trapped from the limiting beliefs, from the value systems, from the traumas we had early on as children. And without recognizing it, we carry this thing for the rest of our lives. Now, I want to bring you to a very important concept called Portland Syndrome. What is Portland Syndrome? Well, Portland Syndrome is what happens when people go to Portland, Oregon, and realize it is rainy and it is damp a lot. This happens in Seattle, so you can call it Seattle Syndrome as well. But what would happen is that over time, in just a couple of weeks, you start to get used to not having the sunshine of this heavy weather, of just being more indoors, and it just changes your outlook in life. And how do we do this? And why do we do this? We do this to survive. And so we've got this survival mechanism to adapt to potentially some traumas, which unfortunately bad weather is for many people. In fact, it actually can cause things like seasonal affective disorder, where your mood actually changes. Why is this relevant? It just demonstrates that because we are so adaptable, that we adapt to these things and we see reality as it is, the people with Portland and Seattle syndrome, because they've adapted to those things, potentially forgotten the joy of sunshine, the joy of moving around, the joy of being able to connect in this weather, the joy in general, because you have more serotonin released when sunshine is around. But what if Portland, or what if Seattle, was a trauma that you faced in childhood? Was a way one of your parents or teachers treated you? Are you shutting away from the possibility of joy, happiness, or how you approach things because you have adapted to potentially some form of traumatic incident as a child? So today we're going to uncover some of those things. And if you have children in your life, so important, because we give you some tools as to how to allow them to be them, how not to inadvertently suppress their expression. This is so important. And today's guest is actually world-renowned parenting expert, the wellness mama, Katie Wells. She's got many children of her own, so she really knows her stuff. This is actually a conversation I had in the Thrive State Summit, where I had an opportunity to interview 50 of the world's thought leaders in mental and emotional wellness, including Kyle Cease, Bruce Lipton, Vishen Lakhiani, Dave Asprey, Jim Quick. And this is a part of an interview in that series. And in fact, if you're interested in getting that content, go to mythrivestate.com/pro to see all the digital assets we have. In fact, by being a loyal listener, you get 50% off by using the code ThriveState50. So go check that out if you are interested in some really transformative digital content. Now, before we get into the conversation, I want to remind you all, if this podcast has given you value, go ahead, subscribe, comment, give it 5-star reviews wherever podcasts are heard. It's going to allow more people to have access, and for me to be able to have access to more guests that want to share these messages. So help us out, do us a favor by really engaging with us. This really allows the show to grow. And without further ado, let me introduce to you to the wellness mama herself, Katie Wells. Hello and welcome back to another session of the Thrive State Summit. I'm your host, Dr. V, and with me today is Katie Wells. She's the founder and CEO of wellnessmama.com and Wellniece. She is a mom of 6 with a background in journalism, and she took health into her own hands and started researching to find answers to her health struggles. Her research turned into a blog and then a podcast, and now she's written over 1,500 blog posts, 3 books, and was named one of the 100 most influential people in health and wellness. When she's not reading medical journals, she's creating recipes or recording podcasts, and you can find her somewhere outside in the sun with her kids or undertaking some do-it-yourself project. Now, some really random facts about her. She's a doula, a speed reader. She hates bananas, loves baseball, scuba diving, and she loves spending time with her 6 kids, which is why she is very highly experienced in answering the question, why?
Thanks for having me.
I've become a new parent. I was a bonus dad for 5 years. She's 9 years old now. And my daughter's now 2.5. And so I'm recognizing the different type of stressors that come along with parenting. Members, both mothers and fathers, what have you found to be the major core stressors that parents experience?
Range of stressors, but the good news is I think actually most of them are very much within our control to shift. So there's the obvious one of lack of sleep, and that one is somewhat situational. When you have newborns, sleep is going to be affected. The good news there is from a physical health standpoint, we actually do get some good hormones that help us at least mitigate the effects of less sleep in that early phase. And then beyond that, there's a lot we can do with having a consistent routine with the kids. One thing that worked really well for me was from the time they were little babies to take them out with me outside first thing in the morning, which is a great habit and free that anyone can do. But with babies, especially, their circadian rhythm tends to adapt pretty quickly. So if you can get them out in the sunlight, it doesn't have to be a long amount of time. It doesn't have to be bright sunlight, but window, that will actually help line up their circadian rhythm early. So that was a big needle mover for me. And then the other one I see, especially for parents, that seems pretty parent specific is the decision fatigue / open loop overwhelm that can happen.
Wow.
Parents, and we're now responsible for the health and well-being of these other people. I find that often it's not actually all the things we have to do that is the source of stress. It's all the open loops related to knowing that we have to do all those things. When I realized that, I realized I could solve for that variable of reduced stress, not reduced workload, by putting in some simple structures in place that took the mental load off, whether that was bulk cooking when the kids were little, so I knew when food prep was going to happen, or having set times for laundry so that I wasn't thinking about needing to do laundry until it was time to do laundry. And those are obviously simple examples, but I think especially when we have little ones and there is just more built-in chaos, any kind of external structure we can put in place, even temporarily as a habit, really helps reduce that mental load, which I think is really the variable we're focused on with parents. We can't just not do the things that our kids need, but we can focus on reducing our own mental stress related to how those things get done.
Parenting involves, I know for many people, and certainly for my love, almost she puts herself last. She puts the kids first, then she'll think about everything that she's doing for work. She'll think about me, and she always puts herself last. And your thriving business and being a mom of 6, to be able to tend to yourself, and how important is that?
And for me, I'm now a single mom of 6, so I've had to actually get much better about this in the recent few years. But for a lot of years, I was in that same position of realizing in hindsight, I had like caretaker wounds and that I felt safest when everybody else was taken care of.
Yeah.
But learning that you can only pour from an empty cup for so long. The analogy I've heard used is you need to fill your own cup so you're not just giving love from the saucer, and that all the Stoic analogies of you can only give love that you have for yourself. I also realized with my kids, they pay attention so much to what we do, and certainly a little bit to what we say also, but that I had to learn to model that from a place of authenticity for them, that I couldn't just tell them those things were important and have it stick unless I showed them. And so now I really build in the things that give me energy into my day. And so I've realized, I think self-care has gotten a little bit of there's misconceptions around it, especially for moms. It's not just the bubble baths and the like quiet times or the glass of wine or all the things that memes would tell us are self-care. I think it's really evaluating what things actually bring me joy, bring me energy, and bring me life, which could be exercise. It could be reading a book. It could be organizing something. It could be any number of things, but figuring out those things and making them actual scheduled priorities before the kind of optional things. So obviously we can't let go of the things like feeding our families or taking care of our kids and have to give the same priority to taking care of ourselves as we do to our kids, which also really, I think, shifts the energy around it, because then that helps avoid that kind of like resentment that can creep in when you're taking care of everybody else, but not yourself.
Yeah.
And then also it gives your kids permission to take care of themselves by them seeing you do it.
Has there ever been any conflict where there was probably your desire for self-care and your kid's desire for you to be present somehow? And how have you resolved that conflict? Have there been methods of communicating that mommy needs a little time to herself now?
Mentally, that helped me was understanding when I interviewed a child psychiatrist that they actually really only need about 10 to 15 minutes of focused one-on-one time where we're truly present every day, which is not that much. But when you actually take an audit of how much time are we spending focused on them without a phone or a screen involved, great thing here is that by front loading that time, I feel like the kids feel more connected. And so they don't feel like there's any kind of loss if I need to take time for self-care.
Yeah.
So that's one thing I try to do in the morning after I do my morning routine and get sunlight and get hydration and minerals is as much as possible before school, spend one-on-one time with each of the kids. And as teenagers get older, it tends to be more nighttime conversations with them. But I find those little touch points become really important to them so that they understand and respect a lot more when I say, I'm going to go take some quiet time and read for a little while. The other thing I found is I know it's often talked about in the conscious parenting movement, but often when kids act up, it's actually a request for connection. It's just they're making that request in the framework that they have that sometimes to us makes it hard to want to connect with them. So if you can front load that connection, another tip when it does come to a head and emotions flare or kids get upset, one thing I've learned is putting kids in timeout is relatively ineffective because then you're making them do something they don't want to do. You're teaching them isolation when they have big emotions, and you have to then make sure they stay in timeout, which is now a full-time job for you until they're done. And what I realized was more effective was especially if I felt myself getting emotionally worked up or triggered, instead of yelling, which I thankfully never done with my kids, but instead of letting my own emotions flare, I realized I could, instead of forcing their behavior, I could model it by saying, I love you very much, and I need to go take some quiet time to breathe right now so that my emotions can calm down. And then I would love to have a conversation with you about this when we're both calm. And then I put myself in timeout. And so that way I'm modeling for them. If you have that power too. You can always take a step back. You can always breathe for 5 minutes. And you can always request to not have a conversation until you're ready to have it. And that's helped put a lot.
Now, in terms of modeling emotions that come up inevitably in all humans, and you also mentioned the concept of conscious parenting. What are some of those core principles of what conscious parenting is now, and how does that help us become better parents?
Conversation. I think I probably have a little bit of my own definition of it, but that builds on the same principles you would see across the conscious parenting framework. For me, the thing I always try to keep in mind is that each of my children are their own infinite autonomous beings who are not mine. I just simply get to go on this journey of parenting them. And so I try to frame every interaction with them through that lens, which means they're innately worthy of love and respect. I want to support their autonomy and their decision-making within safe boundaries that help them to grow as a person, and also understanding I have no control over them. And I think parents may resist that statement a little bit, but any parent who's had, like you, a 2-year-old knows that at the end of the day, you can't really make them do anything they don't want to do. When they're little, you can physically move them somewhere. But if they don't want to eat, you're not going to get them to eat. And if they don't want to sleep, you're not going to be able to force them to sleep. And so instead of focusing on the control side, focusing on the connection side. And there's some great examples of this I've seen dispersed online about the idea of parents. I think it's disrespectful when a kid looks them in the eye and says no. But how many times as parents do we look our kids in the eye and tell them no? And so like keeping that same level of respect, obviously parents have an authority position and we do have to guide them, but realizing that they're the ones walking the journey, we're just walking with them. We're not dragging them by the hand on this journey, is more focused on connection than control and more focused on the long-term outcomes than short-term compliance, which I think is a really important distinction because it can be a lot more work in the beginning. And when you're trying to help a child understand the emotional root of where something's coming from and to keep your own calm in that process when they have big emotions, it certainly can require some self-regulation on behalf of the parents. But I really firmly believe that when we can model that and when we're able to look in and fix the things in ourselves that are being triggered, that not only shifts our interactions with our kids on a practical level, but it also shifts it energetically, and that they can then start to see from how we do it that they can regulate their own emotions, which long term is much more effective than if we just mandate and regulate their emotions for them.
For one, really being able to model that for your kids. I could being a dad myself, there has been so much of a healing journey. And you mentioned, triggers that come up. I get or potentially past traumas that I never really got to release, and that I'm not projecting my trauma responses onto my children, but really be able to explore that within myself. Can you maybe share what that looks like for you when you get triggered, and maybe what the steps are for you in terms of being able to release or to integrate or move through that trigger?
Learning process as parents, and I've seen it shift for me with each of my kids, and now with all 6 of them, and even in relation to their personalities and their trigger, like how we can trigger each other. And I think the beauty of our kids is they do have some traits that come from us, so they become wonderful mirrors, sometimes potentially very frustrating mirrors, but wonderful mirrors. Early on in my own trauma journey, I actually had a therapist say, never waste a trigger. And I learned to become very grateful, actually, for the ways that my kids knew me so well, that they had these experiences that would be great for triggering me. And I felt like that showed me so much about myself. Not that it's easy in those moments to keep our calm and to self-regulate, but it helps at least to have that awareness so that we can anticipate those moments and maybe have a mental framework or a plan ahead of time. So for me, this is things like I try to be honest with my emotions with them in a way that doesn't put any emotional burden on them, with the understanding that we as parents are responsible for being emotional support for our children, but they, especially at young ages, don't need to be emotional support for us in the same way. That's what friends are for, partners are for, therapists are for. But also being honest when I have big emotions, or when I get angry or upset or feel sad or feel grief, to give them the language by showing them through my own words how to label those things. And from young ages, we also have conversations around trying to connect the emotions to the body feelings that can go with them. I read the book years ago, The Body Keeps the Score, which was really impactful for me. And I learned from a young age, kids are actually pretty great at understanding that connection. I think many of us disconnect as we get older, or we put in defense mechanisms. But with kids, when they're little even, it can become a fun game and conversation around that. When big emotions come up, I'm asking, where do you feel it in your body? And what does it feel like? What's the texture of it? What's the color of it? Is it hot or cold? Which also helps take them out of the maybe brain space of that experience and help them recenter in their body. And then a lot of the things I learned as self-regulation tools, I started doing with my kids, and thinking from a young age, maybe they'll have a better foundation so that they're not in their 30s like I was in therapy trying to unpattern those things. Maybe they get to start on a higher step of that journey than I did. So we'll do things like tapping, or like a double tap with hands like this, where you alternate and tap on each hand twice. And even with that, I've walked them through some of the things that have been helpful to me. So an easy one for parents, if they're having a big emotion, this is great for teenagers too, is while doing that process, you figure out what the emotion is or the problem is that they're trying to work through, and then what the desired feeling is. And you say, even though I'm experiencing, for instance, anger, I love and accept myself when I now choose to let go and feel joy, or whatever the situational thing may be. And just the combination of the somatic with the words related to the emotion seems to help really take the intensity out of that for them and bring more awareness back into their body and back into their breathing.
I hope you're enjoying the podcast so far. If you are, I just wanted to let you know, join our community. There's so many free resources and a great community of people that desire health, happiness, human potential, to have more in their life, more health, more energy. And when you have those two things together, you could create more happiness, more abundance, whether it be financial, romantic, all these things in your life. And if you're just starting out, you don't know where to go, just sign up for ThriveStateStarter.com, because in there you're going to get a bundle of information that includes a longevity ebook, a longevity and performance resource guide, lecture notes that come from my keynotes at Google, at Fortune 500 companies, all the insights in that keynote in lecture slide form given to you. And then finally, breathwork. I share 3 powerful breathwork exercises to access calm, which really gives you clarity and peace during the day, to access energy, if you need to wake up and really motivate yourself. And finally, a breathwork routine that you could do every single morning so that you could be very intentional with how you create that day. You could find all this stuff delivered free to your inbox at thrivestatestarter.com. And our community is growing. If you want to be a part of a community of people that desire the Thrive State, that are really in Thrive State themselves and help other people along with that, you could be a part of the community. You can get group coaching from me. We do breathwork sessions, meditation sessions, and you also get to drop in and participate in podcasts in the future. You could find more about the community at mythrivestate.com. That's mythrivestate.com. So check out those resources. You're not going to be disappointed. And please enjoy the remainder of this podcast. Understand that there is a somatic component, and to recognize that, and then really implement some of those strategies just to start to get through that. One of the things that I started to recognize with ourselves earlier on when we were parenting, as well as some friends, is we have a child who is crying or who is angry or demonstrating potentially negative emotions, somebody to just feel what they feel rather than mitigate them, or maybe share that it's maybe wrong to emote whatever they might be feeling inside.
Actually, the framework for myself as an adult, and one that I try to help my kids have more understanding about from a younger age. So my backstory is that I had a pretty traumatic experience in high school. And after that, basically locked down emotions because I was unwilling to feel a lot of things and had no big emotional spikes for over a decade. So I didn't cry, I didn't yell, and it turns out that's actually not good for your nervous system. So in therapy, I had to learn things like how to rehab a temper tantrum and how to let those emotions process and how to do somatic movements that let the emotions pattern from my body. So in our house, we have a lot of conversations around the two separate factors that are at play. Anytime there's a big emotional response, there's the emotion itself, which is valid and worth feeling and worth understanding. And then there's actions that might result from the emotion, but that we have choice over. So with kids, for instance, we talk about, okay, you felt angry, or I don't put the words in their mouth, but like, how did you feel? Okay, I understand you felt angry. It's okay to feel angry. And we talk a lot about if you resist those emotions, they tend to actually linger longer and to let it work through your body. However, as a result of you feeling anger, you also made the choice to hit your sister. And the action of that is what's not okay. And so helping them separate those things, because often you'll hear kids and adults now make statements like, I did that because she made me mad. And so then we unpattern that of, does any other person actually have the power to make you do anything or to make you feel anything? Or did you choose to do that action because you were feeling this big thing, but that was still your choice? So I try to give them language around separating those things and communicate that the emotions are always fine. And it's okay to feel even emotions like anger, or even emotions like boredom is a great one. I think for kids to feel grief or to feel despair or whatever they may be feeling, that's valid. And I want to hear about it and support them through it. And you still, even in those big emotions, have choice over what you do with your body in those experiences.
With some somatic therapy, can you briefly just describe in your words what that means, and maybe include one or two exercises that might be really easy for people to access and have this tool to use in the future?
Great tutorials online for even things like self-hypnosis or somatic release that you can do without a therapist or without any external help. And I think for adults, those, for me at least, have been very valuable self-regulation tools. So I mentioned tapping. This is one that is great to start with kids. There's an app called the Tapping Solution that walks you through protocols for almost anything you could think of that you would encounter. But you could also just do it intuitively. There's tapping points. Most of them are on the head. And I found that kids especially respond really rapidly to this. Even babies, I noticed that I started doing this with my last couple of kids, is when they were worked up or crying, I would soothe them, talk to them, and also just gently tap on their forehead right here, or just gently tap on the top of their head. And that helps the nervous system regulate the left side of the body, right side of the body, which is also right and left side of the brain. So that helps to bring some calm to the nervous system itself. Also, it can be tougher for kids to learn the intentionality around it, but I think kids are actually natural meditators too. And that when you build this in from a young age, they're able to drop into like alpha or theta more easily than adults are. And so I feel like by building that as a habit early on, it's almost like preventative for later on, that they'll have that as a foundational skill that'll feel more intuitive to them. So those are the main ones we focus on our house, but also any kind of movement in a sense is a somatic experience. And statistically, kids and adults are not getting as much movement as they used to. So I think for kids, you can work this in really beautifully just in the umbrella of play by putting things in their environment that promote really good movement patterns and somatic movement. And so for us, my house definitely doesn't look like a magazine or a conventional house, but we put a lot of these in intentionally. So in our kitchen, there's a climbing hangboard across the doorway, the gymnastics track down our hallway. There's mini trampolines in the house. There's things they can literally climb on in the house. And I'm a big proponent of, I will just paint when the kids are all grown. And for now, do handstands. There'll be footprints on the walls and you can box jump on the coffee table or whatever you want. But for kids, especially, so much of their experience of life is processed through movement. So the more opportunities we can give them to move indoors, outdoors, slacklining, swinging, climbing, that actually really helps their nervous system. And so I think for kids, especially, the simple things are often the most effective, but sometimes often the most overlooked because they are so simple.
Wow. You mentioned just now like a bridge to meditation. And I wonder how often you incorporate that into your own life now. And is it too early? And how do you start to implement that in the lives of our children?
Especially help with things like sleep and routine. So in some of the therapies I did for my own healing, I did things like hypnosis and I mentioned the somatic ones. And I realized that some of the languaging of that is really helpful, even unofficially, not in a hypnotic state, but just unofficially with our kids. And so I found myself using a lot of that language of kind of stair stepping them into deeper relaxation. Even I would work it into a bedtime story. Or we would do, as I was tucking in the little ones especially, I would walk them through almost a meditation / hypnosis script. And we would focus on relaxing each area of our body piece by piece. And then imagining the space around our body and I would have them think of like the space between your eyeballs, think of the space between your ears, try to feel the space around your belly button or whatever it would be. And then I would say, now try to feel space around your whole body. Try to feel the space of the whole room. Try to feel the space of the whole house, and just like walking them through that relaxation process of diffusing the energy around them often is really effective at helping them sleep as well. So just fun ones like that. I feel like kids love guided ones. And there's now even scripts for those on like YouTube or Spotify where parents can find those and do them with their kids. And again, I think it's also a thing of modeling. If they see us do that and they see us make something a priority, they're more naturally curious about it or more willing to be curious about it.
That's amazing. And how early have you tried? Like, how old were your kids to be able to sit down and
Older ones, so I didn't start as early with them.
Yeah.
With my younger ones, this started almost from day one because I feel like if a parent can even use a relaxed, almost hypnotic voice with a baby,
Yeah.
babies so naturally match our nervous system energy.
Yes.
So
Yeah.
as parents, I'm sure you saw this with yours, like the more we be in a state of calm and peace, the more they will match that energy. And if we're feeling chaotic, they often will feel chaotic too. And so from day one, as I was putting them to sleep, I would use some of that language. Or even now with my youngest is now 17. And then recently I was babysitting a friend's kid and she's about 2 and was resisting sleep and did not want to go to sleep. And so I did the same thing with her where I held her and just bounced her gently and then walked her through slowly down the stairs. And there was beautiful water. And I would use that language and we relax more as we go deeper and deeper. And she fell completely asleep and was out for 4 hours. So I feel like that's a helpful tool for parents and you can find resources for that online.
Wow, I am definitely going to YouTube to find some of these scripts that I could potentially use. I tell stories of different animals. She loves animals right now, and just telling them how each family member, each ant has a mama ant and the daddy ant, and they're closing their eyes and they're relaxing. And then I move to the next animal, and that seems to work. But I can't wait to try some of these newer scripts. Conscious parent, do we take on this role of disciplining without punishment or control? Does that play part the disciplining process at all? And probably your own development and growth as a mother has changed there. It's probably never too late to change the way we parent. What have you been able to see in terms of how early you start this new process of how you treat your children and how they develop later on?
Been to almost 17. I was definitely more traditionally strict with the older ones. And then I've shifted. So my youngest has pretty much had this sort of form of parenting her whole life. I have found that it's also a great chance to be vulnerable and have some humility as a parent, because sometimes the older ones will say things like, why aren't you doing this with her? Because with us, you made us go to timeout, or whatever the thing is.
Yeah.
That's a great time to be like, you know what? You're right. And I am really sorry. I didn't know then what I know now. And honor things in them. I'm really proud of how you learned this in spite of me not being the best parent at that moment. Or I really love how you went on your own growth journey. Or I feel like those become great conversation points. And the great thing is, too, I believe that we only have so much impact as parents. Kids are always on their own journey, and they're going to turn out how they want to turn out at the end of the day, which is awesome. My goal is not to direct who they are, but to help support them in discovering who they are. And so I feel like even the things that weren't ideal, even the moments we aren't perfect as parents, are actually perfect in themselves, because our kids learn life lessons from that. And certainly they're not in the adult world going to only interact with people who are self-regulated and have the same framework and the same tools. So I feel like even though I wish I could go back and change those experiences sometimes, I feel like they actually benefited in different ways still from those. But the younger ones themselves with self-regulation at times, or to use the same language I use with them back to each other. So one day my second youngest was upset about something, and my youngest was trying to comfort her. And I went in to see if she was okay and stopped at the door and heard my youngest ask her, the second youngest was explaining why she was upset. And the youngest goes, is that true? What else could be true? What would it feel like if that weren't true? And she started asking her the questions that I would have asked. And
Wow.
they had that conversation on their own. So I think it's really incredible how kids are able to understand so much from such a young age, and then to even build that into how they interact much earlier than I would have expected.
Role and to start to understand that they are infinite, independent beings. How much of your own journey and healing that you had to do first and take that new perspective for your children?
Like I said, it's been interesting to how the older ones, we've been able to have such strong relationships as learned along the way, just at a later age. But I really think as parents, the greatest gift we can give our kids is to go on that journey ourselves. And that the greatest thing we can do for them is to show up for them as a calm parent and a regulated parent and a safe place for them to have big emotions without judging those emotions. Because I feel like often, at least for me, the things I unpatterned was largely self-judgment around normal human emotions, and learning the framework that it's perfectly fine and valid to have those emotions. I just don't have to resist them or hold on to them. And so I think when we model that, our kids get that capacity at a much younger age. And maybe they get to avoid some of those pitfalls of feeling things like guilt or shame around emotions that naturally happen as human beings.
Sensing your energy for people, just how important it is for us to do our own work. What have been some of those key resources for you to work on your own emotional regulation? And what have been the major resources parents can use to start to implement, learn more about conscious parenting and those techniques?
And you a list if you want to put them in the notes associated with this. But honestly, some of my most impactful books have not been parenting books directly. I would say books that are recurring reads for me yearly at least are things like The Four Agreements, which we have hanging at our house, and then also to have lots of conversations around, because I think, again, often the most simple things can be the most effective. They're just often the most overlooked. I also reread at least once a year Man's Search for Meaning by Viktor Frankl, which helps me have perspective of, even when I feel like things are hard, they're not actually that hard. And even when they are hard, I can still choose my responses. And so
Yes.
I've loved his work. I feel those two would be big ones for me. And then beyond that, some parenting books have been helpful, but I also feel like we're each parenting our own children in their own individual experience. So while we can get some good frameworks and generalities from parenting approaches, at the end of the day, each child requires their own approach, and it's going to be adaptive to them. So it really just goes back to that principle of the connection and having a relationship with them to understand that, and the communication that allows for safety in both directions.
One of the resources is going to be this interview that I listen to over and over again because there's so many pearls and nuggets, and I think I want to pick out different things and go deeper on it. And so thank you for being a model for that, not only for myself, but I'm sure for our audience who really gets the benefit from that. More about what you do, your blog, and the upcoming works that you'll be taking part of.
Yeah, so everything is centered on wellnessmama.com. And I do have some resources mostly geared toward moms, but to parents in general, as well as some general health and wellness resources. And then I have a podcast called the Wellness Mama Podcast. We actually do quite a bit of parenting topics on that as well. So people can find both of those on wellnessmama.com, or the podcast is anywhere that podcasts stream. And I think the centering advice I always leave with parents also is that if you can just keep in mind when kids get chaotic, that often they're having a problem, not being a problem. I know that's very cliche, but that helps me reframe. And then I love the Walt Whitman quote that's also quoted in my favorite TV show of all time, Ted Lasso, which is be curious, not judgmental. And I think if we only did that, if that's the only shift we made, not just in a relationship with our children, but our relationship with life and with anybody else that we encounter, if we can stay in curiosity and not judgment, that gets us 80% of the way there.
Oh, curiosity is certainly a superpower. So thank for reminding us of that. I am just so amazed and inspired by your life, your work, and your dedication to improving yourself and really being a resource for people who need it. I connect with you. And I really have to say that I am deeply inspired to do more work because of your example. So thank you.
Oh, well, thank you so much. This has been such a fun conversation, and I love this topic, and I'm so grateful we got to connect.
I hope you enjoy that episode of the Thrive State podcast. And if you're finding that this content is really helping you and your family members, please consider supporting our mission and our cause of elevating health, happiness, and human potential for people all over the world. You can do so by making sure that you subscribe to this podcast, sharing it with your friends and family members, and leaving us a 5-star review wherever podcasts are heard. All these things are going to really help elevate the show and to give us the resources to continue to bring more content just like this to yourself as well as the people that you love. If you haven't already, you might want to consider joining our community. We actually have a community where people get to engage with me in group sessions where we do breath work, meditation, where we do challenges together, really to be able to get us access to health, happiness, human potential so that we can have longevity and performance in our life as well. You can check out our community at mythrivestate.com. That's mythrivestate.com. And if you haven't already, pick up a copy of my book, Thrive State. It really gives you all the tools, the pillars that you need to create a blueprint to control the energetics of your life. Who are you? How you show up in the world? The choices that you consistently make create an energy in your body, and you can control this. And when you can control that, you also control the messages you give to your DNA that gives you access, again, to optimal health, longevity, and peak performance. And let me also just share a free gift to you. If you haven't already, please pick up my longevity and performance bundle where I share lecture notes, ebooks, breathwork exercises, and longevity and performance resources at thrivestatestarter.com. Thank you so much for being a part of this community. Thank you for helping us grow. Remember always, my friends, that you are your best medicine.